All right, you got 3 minutes, and you all know where you're scoring, right? Affirmative opener, and whenever you start talking, I got this.
In 1942, shortly after the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government displaced over 100,000 Japanese Americans from their homes and sent them to live in militarily controlled camps. It wasn't until almost 40 years later that the case was reopened by John F. Kennedy, and this action was found to have been simply based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. In response, the U.S. government paid each survivor $20,000 in reparations, in all over $1.6 billion. This action was easily justified because of the horrific hardships that were faced by these oppressed people. However, there's another event in history that parallels immensely, but has yet to be repented in the way the Japanese displacement was. The transatlantic slave trade lasted from 1550 to 1850. And once it was ended and slaves were freed, conditions hardly improved. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves were denied work as well as many educational opportunities. In addition to this, many were convinced that they were, in fact, subhuman, proving that the psychological impact alone is nearly unrepentable. Some may argue that slavery ended hundreds of years ago and is only present in history books. However, that is quite the contrary. Shortly after the end of slavery in the South in 1865, and freedom was in sight, the Jim Crow laws were enacted in 1876 and were not ended until roughly 50 years ago, in 1965. These laws allowed for segregation of everything including restaurants, grocery stores, and public schools. Although slavery itself was eradicated, the polarizing dehumanization of African Americans was still alive and well, only furthering the economic gap faced by the African American community even today. According to a 2012 U.S. Census Bureau American Community Survey, the poverty rate for all African Americans in 2012 was 28.1%, where for Caucasians the rate was a mere 11.6%. This long history of racial economic divide can all be traced back to the slave trade and the domino effect it had on the rest of African American history. However, the Reparations Coordinating Committee proposes a proactive solution. The group advocates a collective reparation that would lead to the establishment of trust funds, reforms, policies, and programs designed to strengthen Black institutions to overcome the deeply rooted historical inequalities inherited from centuries of overt discrimination. And while these reparations could hardly mend the wounds of these horrible times in history, it's a start.
Give us scores a second. Sorry.
How do we analyze the reputation?
Did they take into account what the other side might say?
Did they anticipate counter-argument? Janelle, 1 second, sorry.
We need to teach about causation.
Okay, whenever you are ready, I will time.
After a Dutch ship brought 20 Africans to the British colony at Jamestown in 1619, slaves quickly grew to consist of 1/3 of the population according to history.com. Violent abuse, physical exhaustion, and rape were common to the Black slave. The Jim Crow laws were racial segregation laws enacted between 1876 and 1965. In the United States and at the local level, separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms, and separate schools were all common to these Jim Crow laws. Segregation ran rampant throughout the United States less than 60 years ago. Still today, African Americans face racism and inequalities on a less direct level. There is no doubt that something needs to be done in order to patch these wounds and created by our ancestors. My opponents believe that paying reparations to slave descendants will fix decades of slavery. This illusion of altruism is simply used to rid whites of their guilt. Reparations are not the answer. If a serious conversation regarding reparations were to happen, certain questions would appear such as, where does this money come from? Who exactly will this money go to? And how do we decide how much money each individual receives? These questions show that reparations, while a great idea, are not a practical solution. According to HistoryNewsNetwork.org, the criteria for reparations is so intricate that most descendants and African Americans might not be eligible for this share of the money. The complexities of reparations diminish its bizarre excuse of an apology. We are not saying that African Americans don't deserve the apology or repayment, or that slavery wasn't a horrendous act. However, reparations will not eliminate this racism and inequality or other discrimination acts on the blacks. According to the National Coalition of Blacks from Reparations in America, reparations would mean payment to all African American descendants in the United States, even those answers were not. For some descendants of persons held in the U.S., no monetary sum can compensate for the enslavement of their ancestors. This further emphasizes by the fact that a sufficient amount of money would cost way too much. According to the BlackAgendaReport.com, it is estimated that each descendant would owe $1.5 million. This calculation is only in terms of stolen actual labor counted in person hours, which does not include reparation for physical violence, genocide stress, and inadmissibilities to the superior social class. The totals out to be $59.2 trillion, which would be divided out to all 44 African Americans, according to the NCOBRA. This money would be coming out of Americans' people tax dollars, and every American, including the African Americans, would end up paying an estimated total of $188,595. It is impractical to put a dollar amount on the torture slaves went through. Reparations are implausible and should not be further considered. Do I just start? Yeah. Okay. Reparations to ancestors of slaves in the United States should be paid because the effects of slavery did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, the Jim Crow laws went into place in 1876 and were enforced on a state and local level. These laws restricted any sense of true equality, and this ideology of inferiority undoubtedly stems from slavery. While there may be no living slaves today, those who lived in the era of lawful Jim Crow hate crimes are still alive. Additionally, countless racially charged crimes and flat-out racism, which is certainly rooted from the history of slavery, are still practiced, most of the time without real reprimand or consequence, as can be seen in such cases as the murder of African-American Florida resident Trayvon Martin, a tragic event in our nation's very recent past. To argue that the descendants of slaves do not deserve some sort of apology for the treatment of their ancestors and the treatment of their culture is nonsensical, especially taking into account that the United States government did just that in response to those who suffered in Japanese internment camps in order to compensate for racial prejudice and national misdeeds. The United States, which thrives on the democratic system, should make a long overdue democratic move in order to fix previous mistakes just as it did for Japanese Americans in the 1980s. One could argue that reparations seem like some sort of guilt-ridden payoff. However, the money does not necessarily need to go to individuals and instead could be used to fund programs in education, training, and economic development. All of these programs could greatly influence the undoing of wrongs in a positive and social manner. Reparations won't fix everything, but it's a start. In our progressive society, past offenses must be taken into consideration and righted before we can ever truly move forward.
All right, give us about 10 seconds to finish scoring. All right, ready, Raleigh? All right, ready? Raleigh, when you start talking, I start timing.
According to the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, reparations would mean payments to all Black Americans of African descent in the United States. So an immigrant who came from Uganda in 2002 deserves money for the exploitation of African slaves who were stolen and brought here in the 1800s? And what about interracial people? Will they only get a fraction of the normal payment? Reparations will be too hard to manage and track down the people who allegedly deserve the money. But do they really? Keep in mind, they aren't the ones who were kidnapped and sold into slavery to be oppressed for the rest of their lives. Like my opponent stated, in the case of Pearl Harbor, the individuals compensated were directly affected because they lived during the time. It's almost impossible to attribute the problems of African Americans face today with something that occurred almost 150 years ago. And the citizens of the U.S. who will be paying them aren't the individuals who were the oppressors. Also, the majority of whites who lived in the South during slavery weren't even a part of the slaveocracy. According to townhall.com, around 90% of Southerners during the time of slavery didn't own a slave. Now, the opposing team has argued that reparations are a good idea and can help improve the lives of African Americans while lowering the poverty rate. However, this will only be short term. According to NeoWin, 70% of lottery winners go broke in just a few years. In that same study, it claimed 70% of people who unexpectedly receive large sums of money go broke in 7 years. Paying reparations to African Americans will only temporarily help the initial recipients, and it won't even have a lasting effect that can benefit many future generations. And just because the U.S. gives African Americans money doesn't mean that it will put an end to racism, the cause of racial segregation. In the 1950s, West Germany began paying reparations to Israel because of the Holocaust. It is over 60 years later, and racism towards Jews still exists, and there are still groups out there that want the people of Israel eradicated. The idea of reparations is just a temporary solution that doesn't have positive, long-term effects.
Timer. Okay. We are on our close, and Evan, when you start talking, I'll start timing.
Okay. Now, the opposition argues that one of the main flaws in compensating the relatives of blacks involved in slavery would be finding them and proving that their ancestors were actually slaves. But rather than heading down yonder and cracking open some of the local church records, I suggest you set down the quill and pick up a keyboard. Now, using modern technology, things like Ancestry.com, heck, even the internet in general, is this task that was previously perceived to be very large, that's no longer the case. A simple Google search turns up thousands and thousands of search results for your own family history. Now, they also argue that the reason the Japanese people were compensated is because they were still alive. And even though that was still true, in this case, the focus on is on the suffering of the current generation and the domino effect that Carolyn explained earlier. Now, even though they say that the reparations may be drastic and unnecessary, however, you need to take into account the immense toll and blight in history that is taken on the course of the progress of one race. It is hard to find a justification for the reparations of the displaced Japanese Americans, but not to the over 2 million people ripped from their homeland and forced to work under the yoke with no more power than an animal. Another argument that they make is that paying the slaves would not decrease the poverty rate. And the definition of poverty is, according to dictionary.com, the state of being extremely poor. So I simply don't understand how giving them money would not reverse this. Not only would it decrease poverty for them at that current time, but it would also open new opportunities for success in the future. Overall, the relatives of slaves are clearly paying for the brutal actions of what white people did to their ancestors, and the government has compensated people before, so why can't they do it again? Especially to a cause that is far more serious.
Oh, that was the rest of your sentence. Sorry, I thought you were done with your sentence. Very good, thank you. And our final close for today. Clearly we're not going to get to our third debate, so here we go. What? Yeah. I'll jump up there. Okay, Tara, our last person for today. Yeah, we're not gonna have time to do the next one, so. Sorry, but go ahead, start. We'll talk about it in a minute. Go, Tara.
Okay. Yes, slavery and segregation are wrong and extremely terrible, but that isn't what we are arguing here. What we are arguing is the best way to brighten the future of African Americans today and future generations to come. By paying these reparations, the problem isn't solved. How can we put a price on such a sensitive time in history? We need to give African Americans opportunities to improve their lives and the lives of other generations. In Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, Query 18, he states about slavery, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." 80 years later, a terrible war broke out in the United States over the issue of slavery. In the aftermath of the war, there were over 620,000 soldiers dead. This hell Americans today call the Civil War was caused by slavery. The U.S. has already paid an enormous price for its involvement in the slave trade. Thousands of men put their lives on the line to give African Americans the freedom they deserved. So to say reparations are needed to give back to black citizens isn't true. However, that doesn't mean the U.S. shouldn't help improve the lives of its citizens. The U.S. doesn't owe African Americans money. It owes them the tools to make better lives for themselves. Some of these tools have been accounted for by such programs as affirmative action, but raising of awareness and respect need to be improved as well. Reparations would not simply mend this gap, but widen it. Raleigh stated that, the opponent states that slave descendants deserve their money for their ancestors' torture, but a monetary value is not applicable to decades of slavery. Since slavery has been abolished, the victims and oppressors have coexisted and integrated. Reparations would be a step backwards by segregating blacks and whites back into the roles of victims and oppressors. A payoff would not fix the inequalities African Americans face, but only help to erase white guilt. Reparations are impractical and honestly not the right solution.
All right.